previewing the 2025-2026 Utah Jazz season up next on the Upper Bowl Perspective. Welcome to another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective, a Utah Jazz podcast giving you elevated takes on Utah Jazz hoops. No lower bowl access required. And Kyler, it has been a hot minute since we have been on the mics talking about the Utah Jazz. The last episode we recorded was back in summer of 2023, just for context in Jazz timeline. This was right after Keontae George was drafted. And really, it was just kind of a weird time, not only in our personal lives, but also to be a Utah Jazz fan. But we are super excited to come back and bringing some of our thoughts on the Utah Jazz. We were actually discussing it earlier this week. You and I were just hanging out. We've been best friends for years and we still talk Jazz all the time. And we were just discussing the season and just how excited we were about how we felt that this season was going to just feel different than it had felt the last couple of years since the Jazz really started their rebuild. And as I thought about it more, I was thinking about how fun it was to watch the Oklahoma City Thunder like a year or two into their rebuild. Back in like 2020, 2021, that team was not good. I think they won 22 games during the COVID season. That was a 72 game season, but they were still fun to watch. They had just traded for SGA. They had Lou Dort, who was super fun to watch on the defensive end. And even though they weren't good, they were frisky. They had a ton of assets, and you can kind of see where the team was going. Next year, they got a little bit better. They added Josh Giddey. Still weren't a good team. They only won 24 games, but you could tell that they were a little bit frisky. And then over the next couple of years, they added Jalen Williams, other Jalen Williams, Chet Holmgren, added guys like Isaiah Hartenstein, Kason Wallace. They got through the draft. And in a short time period, they went from literally being one of the worst teams in the league. And by building through the draft and a couple of smart trades, they have now won the NBA title and are heavy favorites to repeat. Now, I'm not saying that anyone on the Utah Jazz's roster right now is going to be as good as SGA or that the Jazz in 5 years are going to be title tenders. I'm not trying to say that. However, I think what is exciting is that we have enough pieces on our roster now and a clear path forward that even though the Jazz aren't going to win a lot of games this season, I think they're going to be so much more fun to watch than they have been for the last couple of years. So that's my thoughts on the Jazz. Kyler, I'd love to know kind of what you're thinking as we're getting into starting up the pod again.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be back on the mic talking Utah Jazz in front of a camera again. It has been a while. I think mentioning the Jazz and the Thunder is in the same sentence is
Optimistic?
ambitious would be the word
Yeah.
that I would use. Um, and I don't think the Jazz have anybody that's SGA or even J-Dub level right now. I mean, hopefully, there's a lot of excitement around Ace and rightfully so, but I do think to your greater overall point, this is a much more fun team to watch and I think talk about than it has been since we lost Rudy and Donovan, pretty much.
Yeah, it's been a tough couple years being a Utah Jazz fan, but hopefully it becomes a little bit easier to tune in and to watch them over the course of an 82 game season. And really on the pod today, it's been a very exciting offseason, obviously with Ace Bailey coming to the Jazz being kind of that cornerstone piece and that really major storyline that we got during the offseason. But today we really want to do the pod in two parts. First off, we've gone through and we love giving awards. So we wanted to go through and look at what the Jazz did this offseason and also look forward into next season and give some awards to individuals, the team, etc., on what we think the Jazz season is going to look like for the next year. And then we're going to come back in part two. And once again, you and I are competitive. So we have an over under section where we're going to be looking at the Jazz season going forward and seeing which one of us is going to have the better takes on where the Jazz are going to end up at the end of the season. For this first section where we give the awards, we have six, I believe, different awards that we've decided on. We established what the awards are going to be before the pod. However, we have no idea what either of us chose for any of these awards, which should make it a little bit more interesting. But let's go ahead and start off with our first award. And we're starting off pretty basic, which is Best Offseason Move Award, which can be given to the Utah Jazz for whatever we think was the absolute best move they made during the course of the offseason. Kyler, we'll turn it over to you first.
Awesome. I think to start off this off season wasn't there weren't a ton in the way of additions apart from the drafts. And so when you're looking at best offseason moves, you're probably looking at the draft. The other moves were more getting off of players, which you could argue is also good moves. But I think in my mind, by far the highlight of the offseason was Danny Ainge, Austin Ainge, whoever in the Jazz building saying, screw Omar Cooper. We don't care that you want to go to Washington and taking Ace Bailey. Um, Took some balls, and so far, so great. I think they probably had better intel than what was around the league. Everybody thought that it was kind of Ace driving this thing. Of course, after the draft, it comes out that it was his manager, Omar Cooper, who's since been let go. And so the Jazz not playing around with Omar Cooper, selecting who was easily the best like Ainge guy. Just the guys that
Oh,
Ainge
yeah.
takes at the top of the draft, Ace was obviously that kind of guy, taking him despite not quote unquote wanting to come to Utah, not working out for them. I think that was their best offseason move by far.
Yeah, incredible move. I mean, I remember talking with several friends in the week leading up to the draft, and you and I had talked about how Ace is totally a Danny guy. And just the worry about, there's a lot of these guys that through making a ton of money in NIL, being a top recruit for a long time, that some of them have an expectation and don't always aren't super happy with where they end up getting drafted. And that was a legitimate concern for the Jazz, as yes, he might have the highest ceiling in the draft, maybe outside of Cooper Flag. I mean, you can make an argument, but is he going to be a guy who's going to be happy here in a very small market team that is not anywhere close to winning right now? And the early returns have been fantastic. Everything I've heard from the Jazz front office, from the locker room, is that Ace has been a great addition to the team. He seems super happy been here. His performance, which we're going to get into a little bit later, so far has been, I would say, above expectations. And the fact that they just took the guy who they wanted and they felt good about, regardless of what anyone else is going to say, what the fans were going to say. Because I had a couple friends who were upset by that pick. Like they were legitimately upset because they thought Ace was just going to cause drama. But so far, it seemed like we could not have chosen better in the draft. So I think that's an excellent pick. Um, I had the same thought about the Ace Bailey pick, but I wanted to go a little bit of a different route. And I'm going to say the best move we made during the offseason was extending Will Hardy. And here's why. Um, we locked Will Hardy up through 2030, 2031. He's one of the youngest coaches in the league, extremely well respected. Even before he came to the Jazz, he was kind of who's got next among assistant coaches in the league. And the Jazz were the worst team in the league last year. They went 17 and 65. Like that is a truly awful record. And the fact that the Jazz front office and that owner Ryan Smith said, no, this is our guy. This is part of the plan. We're not going to blow everything up and make all these weird, crazy changes, I think really shows how stable the Jazz organization is. That even after having literally the worst record in the league, we were still making the decision to move forward with the plan and not make any dramatic decisions. Um, I think we've seen what happens sometime with some of these newer owners, like Matt Ishbia in the Phoenix Suns, and him just tanking that organization thoroughly has been an example of that. And what the Will Hardy extension showed to me is that we have an incredibly competent front office staff who is willing to do what's best for the team long term and is not willing to sacrifice what we hope the Jazz are going to be in 5 or 7 years just so that we can win a couple more games this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can tell that despite the lack of success record wise, that Will Hardy is not only respected within the Jazz organization, but just nationwide. Anybody who's talking about the Jazz nationwide, they're always talking about how they're a well-coached team. So locking him up, uh, certainly a good move. And he's even, prior to this last year where we tanked really from the beginning, in the two preseason seasons prior, the Jazz were winning more than they probably should have before they decided to tank, and that goes to show how good Will Hardy and his system is. I think he's excellent at getting players who aren't on-ball creators the ball in spots where they're comfortable to score, and it's shown consistently throughout his Utah Jazz tenure.
Yeah. It's going to be so fun to see what he does with Ace, with Walter Clayton, with all the young guys this year. I think it's going to be, even though I don't think we're going to win a ton of games, I think it's going to be so fun to see what a guy like Will Hardy can do with this very interesting roster. All right. Let's move on to the second award, which is the mirror of the first one, which is worst offseason move. We have actually decided to name this award in honor of the 2020 Utah Jazz offseason. Um, I think you and I have actually called each other on the phone like maybe half a dozen times in as many years. And one of them was what the Jazz did on draft night in 2020, where, for those of you who don't remember, in the offseason, the Jazz basically had two assets. They had the mid-level exception and the 27th pick in the draft, and they decided to use both of those assets on backup centers, giving the mid-level to Derek Favors and drafting Udoka Azubuike, who I could not have been more upset that we drafted him. And it just ended up being a terrible offseason for the Jazz, where didn't really move us anywhere closer to contention like we were hoping. So for worst offseason move, which we are dubbing the Favors Azubuike Award, Kyler, what do you got?
Yeah, I think this one's a bit tough because I didn't objectively dislike really anything that they did, but there were certainly some concerns over the trades that they made, and I think some of them were certainly valid. I think the Jazz made those trades mostly to create more opportunities for their young guys, but the fact that they got pretty much nothing back for the guys that have been some of their best players during the tank so far was certainly worthy of some of the malcontent, but I just don't think any of them were objectively bad. So there's two that come to mind. I think one, you have the Colin Sexton trade, and for me, the other is the John Collins trade. With the benefit of hindsight, with what I've seen in the preseason, I actually think all the vets that they got in those two trades have shown different nice things. I'm going to go with the John Collins trade, though, even though they actually got a second round pick instead of giving one up in that trade. Just because out of all those guys, I do think John Collins probably had the most league wide value. So getting two end of career guys and one second round pick, it felt just a little bit light for John Collins. Um, Even though we did actually get a pick, and that was not what we got in our other trades. I just felt like John Collins at times for certain games was the best player on the Jazz last year, and getting one second round pick and a couple of vets, that one hurt even more to me than the Colin Sexton one because that one I understood why Colin Sexton didn't have a lot of trade value around the league. I didn't really feel like I felt like they could have got more for John Collins, but obviously we're not the ones making those calls. But that's ultimately what I decided on was the John Collins trade.
Yeah, I was looking at the exact two trades, Kyler, the John Collins trade and the Colin Sexton trade, deciding which one I disliked more. And I actually disliked the Sexton one just a little bit more than the Collins trade. Um, when you just look at it on paper, I just felt like we just lost the trade. Like we just straight up lost the trade. Sexton was one of the best players for the Jazz last year. He's a very good scorer. He's still only 26, should be entering the prime of his career right now. And we had to attach a 20-30 second to get back Yusuf Nurkic, who is a 32-year-old center. Now, granted, Nurkic has looked awesome so far in the preseason. He's definitely looked better than I remember him being, especially at this age. But we got the older guy back in the trade. Both were expiring contracts. Nurkic is actually making a little bit more than Sexton was. And for me, it just felt like we were getting 70 cents on the dollar in that trade. Um, I think the fact that we only got such little return for Colin Sexton shows how minuscule the trade market was for him. Because I was going into the season going into the offseason thinking there's a few teams that make sense for him. I mean, Miami, Terry Rozier has been terrible for them. Milwaukee Bucks lost Dame. The Celtics, they've kind of had the year from hell season. Maybe he's someone who can come in and play alongside Jaylen Brown. I mean, none of them were exactly perfect fits where it was a clear, absolutely should happen type of trade. But it just felt to me that we gave up one of our best performing players last year who's entering the prime of his career, who's on a very reasonable contract. And, we had to attach assets, to get him out of Utah. So, um, I understand why they did it. We got to open up playing time for all these young guards that we have on our roster. But for me, it was just really disappointing, what the return was we got.
Yeah, I think it's fair on the return, but you could make an argument that he's one of the five worst defenders out of guards in the entire league, which is why ultimately I think there was really no value because the teams that theoretically want him are probably the teams that are good enough that care about defense, and the teams that don't care about defense aren't good enough to want Colin Sexton. So I think, and ultimately they filled backup center, which turns out I think they actually pretty need a lot because I don't know if Filipowski can handle that many minutes at center right now. Um, so that's why I ultimately went John Collins more. But yeah, on the one hand, I see why the Jazz did it. On the other, it did feel just light in terms of return across the board with the trades they made this year.
Yeah, I think everyone knew that we had to make those trades, and they were lowballing us, knowing we didn't really have an option.
Yeah,
So
Sexton was going to have the ball too much, and we need
yeah,
to start knowing about these young guys.
yeah. Which we're going to definitely be talking about those young guys a little bit later in the draft. But can I just say before I move on, I'm grateful these are the two candidates for worst offseason move. I mean, there has been seasons where it's been so much worse than this. And I'm just grateful that like this could have been a disaster and it wasn't a disaster even if they were a little disappointing.
Yeah,
All right. The next award that we want to move on to, we're also dedicating this award to a certain event, and this is the 2011 Draft Award. Um, when you look back at this situation, it's one of the saddest things I can think of. Back in 2011, the Utah Jazz had the third overall pick in the draft. They ended up taking Ennis Cantor with that pick. And later in the first round, who was drafted after Ennis Cantor was Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, and Jimmy Butler. So, needless to say, we did not make the right pick when we selected Ennis Cantor. But yeah, now it just goes to show, are we going to see the same thing happen this year? Now, you and I, we watched the draft together. We were sitting on my couch. You had a historic run of predicting who is going to take which pick in the draft. It was honestly one of the most impressive things I've seen this year. But even though we're happy with the Ace pick and the Walter Clayton pick, we still wanted to look back and think, are there any guys that we could see could make the Jazz regret passing on them down the road?
yeah. And just to clarify, you're tasked with choosing somebody who, with the wall pick that they could regret passing on, and I'm tasked with the Ace Bailey pick. And I just want to clarify that because if I had to do either, I mean, I would not. I don't. I think the Jazz made the right pick with Ace, is what I'm trying to say. So, I think ultimately they might not regret passing on anybody. But if there is somebody, and I have to choose for this award, you and I both had someone available on our board that was number three on our board ahead of Ace at the time. Maybe not as clean of a fit for the Jazz, which is why I think Ace was a great pick. But the guy just objectively that I was higher on coming out of the draft is Trey Johnson out of Texas. He went the very next pick to Washington, and he is an electric shooter and scorer. So I think Ace has already shown his scoring chops through what he's been able to play for the Jazz. But in case that slows down and Trey Johnson goes on a tear, I think he's another rookie that's going to get a ton of run on his team and could end up putting up 20 points per game in his rookie season. So again, I think ultimately the answer is probably nobody. But if it is somebody, I think it might be Trey Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking about Trey Johnson like a week before the draft and just how much we both loved him. I think we also discussed when we were talking about Trey Johnson just how when you're making a big board, you almost have to make a big board overall and then a big board for your team. And just because like teams have different needs, or there's, somebody like an Ace Bailey who has a crazy high ceiling, but maybe might have a little bit of a lower floor than somebody like a Trey Johnson, just because he has that 3-point shooting elite skill set. At least you can make the argument for it. Um, I'm excited to see Trey Johnson play. Like, if you look at a guy that I love that kind of archetype. Trey Johnson's one of those type of guys. Ultimately, I agree with you. I think we made the right pick, but it's going to be fun to see these rookies. This is looking like it's going to be an awesome draft class across the board, and I think we're going to have a lot of guys who are going to shine in their rookie seasons.
Agree.
Um, for me, I had the 18th pick where the Jazz selected Walter Clayton Jr., and this one was a little bit easier for me. There was a guy that I loved in the draft. I had him 13th on my big board, who I was just praying the Jazz were going to select with that pick, and that is Kasper Shakachonis. He's totally my type of player. He's a very big wing. He's like 6'6". He's got really good size. He was a one and done in college. And he's just kind of a guy who can do a little bit of everything. He's a fantastic passer. I've looked at some of his preseason highlights, and he's looked just like his passing is going to immediately translate to the NBA level. He's shown the ability to score from all three levels. He's not super efficient, but we've seen him take it to the rack. We've seen him have some good mid-range shots, and then he has a good-looking shot from three, even though once again he's a little bit inefficient. I just saw him as a guy who was going to be a floor general type, who was going to be a large guard, and who was just going to come in and develop and make very, very few mistakes and just be a rock solid kind of point guard for a team going forward. Um, and so for me, I was really hoping the Jazz are going to take a swing on him. Taking a guy like Walter Clayton, who's a little bit smaller, um, I just thought that he didn't have as high of a floor as someone like a Jonas had. And I just think that Walter Clayton's definitely a more dynamic scorer. He's a tough shot maker. We saw him in March Madness. He was fantastic. I just thought that Jonas had a game that was maybe a little bit more conducive to the NBA and maybe a little bit more conducive to somebody who might have a starting role on a team down the road, where I think Walter Clayton has a skill set that it it's possible he's maybe a bench guy. And he could be a very good bench guy, but just between the lack of size, the defense, etc., he might not like just being a quality starter in the NBA may not be um, the most likely role for a guy like Walter Clayton. So that being said, I had Walter Clayton in the 20s on my draft. I still liked him. I think he has really high upside considering where the Jazz took him from. But for the 18th pick, just a guy like Jonas, who I thought had such a high floor, I would have rather they selected him.
Yeah, ultimately, you mentioned how I was predicting a bunch of picks in the draft. I actually had the Jazz getting ahead of the Heat and getting Walter Clayton. So
Yeah.
uh, I can't say that I didn't love that pick either. I thought Walter Clayton to the Jazz was a great fit.
Yeah, and just to be clear, like I wasn't upset by them taking Walter Clayton, and he's looked really, really fun in the preseason. Like he actually has a little bit more pop scoring immediately than I thought he was going to have. So I'm excited. I'm not really looking back with so much sadness anymore as I was on draft night. Super excited to have Walter Clayton on the Jazz, but you never know. A couple years down the road, and we'll see what Jonas turns into. It's going to be interesting.
He's on the Heat, so he's probably going to develop.
If he couldn't go to the Jazz, at least he went to the Heat. I think he's going to fit in so well with that culture. All right, back to the Jazz and me getting off Yakachona so I could talk about for another 45 minutes. Um, we also wanted to give an award. Well, it's kind of an award. It's a little bit of a prediction where we look at the Jazz's roster, which is a little bit weird. We have a bunch of interesting players, and not 100% sure what our starting lineups are going to look like or what our rotations are going to look like at this point in the offseason. And so we wanted to predict which five-man lineup we thought was going to have the best net rating for the Jazz next season.
Absolutely. You want me to go first on this one?
Sure.
This is actually pretty hard for me. I was the one that wanted us to do this one just because I think it um will help kind of predict who we think will be good for the Jazz. There were six players that I thought needed to be in this lineup, and unfortunately, only five players can play basketball, so I have to exclude one. And who I'm excluding is very, very difficult. One thing I will say is I think Walker needs to be in it.
Hmm. He was
because
my
I
first
think
one as well.
that's just like there's not going to be a center that I think is going to be a better have a better impact than Walker. I think after what I've seen from Bryce needs to be in this. And from what I'm seeing in the preseason, I think Taylor needs to be in this. So those are the three that I felt I really wanted in my lineup. And there's three other players that I think deserve it, and there's only two more spots. So my lineup's going to have one of two problems. It's either not going to have a point guard, which is not ideal, or it's not going to have one of Ace or Lowry, which is not ideal. Ultimately, I think you're going to have a point guard, so I'm going to put Keontae. And so I'm excluding one of Lowry or Ace, and I'm sorry, but I'm putting Ace Bailey as the last spot, which means I think the best net rating for the lineup won't include their best player, which kind of sounds insane, but hear me out on this lineup. Why I think it's going to be successful net rating wise. I think you have the best shooter on the team in Bryce Sensabaugh, just absolute flamethrower. He's hitting some crazy threes both in summer league and now into the preseason. And then ultimately, I think you have the best defenders at each of the spots surrounding him. And so I think the Jazz, a lot of the different lineups are probably going to play similarly offensively just by the nature of Will Hardy's system. And so I wanted to pick a lineup that might outpace a lot of the other lineups defensively, and which is ultimately why I kind of went with the one absolute killer of a shooter. And ultimately, I think most of the better defenders at each position around him. Not all of the best defenders for sure, I will say that, but mostly like, you know, grading on the curve for the what the Utah Jazz have as far as defense, probably the better defenders.
I went through an incredibly similar exercise. I'm gonna have you guess. Who do you think? Because I had the exact same
No, I'm
six.
not
Who do you think?
guessing.
You're not guessing? Okay.
Nope.
All right.
Give it to me.
I I took out Bryce, and here's why. I just think that the Jazz, with them not being a great team, that I think they're going to have success when they're a little bit weird and when the other team might need to adjust a little bit more than they're used to. And as I was thinking about that, I'm like, a jumbo lineup, I can just see being one of the best lineups for the Jazz next season. So I had Keontae at the one, Ace at the two, Markkanen at the three, Hendricks at the four, and Kessler at the five. So just huge, huge lineup. Ace Bailey is our second shortest player. And then with Keontae just distributing the ball, I mean, those four, everyone other than Kessler is at least a competent shooter to some extent from three. Hendricks has been a little bit off, but like Markin and Ace and Keontae, I think we're all going to be at least serviceable. And just from a defensive standpoint, I love the idea of Ace and Hendricks and Markin and just being long, being switchable, and really just giving grief to opposing units. That being said, I love Bryce. I think he's great. I think if we're looking at purely the plus minus, I just think having just a super jumbo lineup and what that's going to mean defensively for the team is ultimately going to give us the best shot at seeing the highest net rating for a lineup.
Theoretically, yes. And here's why I didn't go with that lineup. Number one, I think it's going to play a ton of minutes. That might actually be their starting lineup. And I think a ton of minutes, the Jazz aren't going to be good. And so with all those minutes, I just don't think they're going to lead in net rating. And then number two, yes, they're very long, but I think Lowry as a perimeter defender is not great. So like, yes, they'll have the length to be a great defense, but Lowry at the three, that's where I think he really can kill teams offensively that way, but defensively, it's been pretty bad on the perimeter.
Yeah, which is super fair. And I think we're not going to know how good that lineup is defensively till we see a little more of Ace against NBA level defenders. And also, we see what we got with Hendricks. He's looked really good in the preseason from a defensive standpoint. I've been impressed, but it's one of those things where it's hard to know how much preseason is going to translate into regular season games. But I think that's a super fair concern. I think Bryce being part of, our best lineup is very possible just because he's such a dynamic shooter. Um, but I think either way, we know who our top six guys are, and that really makes it fun. All right, we have two more awards before we move into the second segment. The next award is second year player most likely to have a breakout season. Last year, the Jazz had three picks. They had Cody Williams, Kyle Filipowski, and Isaiah Collier. And they both had rookie seasons with varying levels of success. And as we look forward to next year, some players get better in their sophomore season, some experience a sophomore slump. And out of these three players, we were able to see quite a few minutes with all three of them, and we've seen a decent amount of them in preseason as well. So, Kyler, out of those three players, who do you think is most likely to outperform expectations going into year two?
I definitely have my opinion on that, but at the same time, I've got him first on like everything today. So I
Yeah,
actually
sure.
want your
I'll go
opinion
first.
first on this one.
Um, I'm gonna go with Filipowski. And this is why I still think there's concerns about him being able to defend as a five consistently. I mean, that is something that, based on his size and everything, I think we're a little bit concerned about. But I was looking through his stats at the beginning of the season and then compare them to like the last 10 games, and he consistently got better throughout the year. He became a better shooter, he became a better passer, his rebounding was better. Just watching those games, it looked like he was getting more comfortable in an NBA style defense. And even though he was still getting bodied around the paint, he was moving better. His lateral quickness looked a little bit smarter. And he just looked like someone who really the last 20 games of the season, and particularly the last 10, was really coming into his own and getting comfortable in his role in the NBA. I still think there's a lot of question marks with him in terms of is he going to be able to defend those big minutes? Um, and is he going to keep growing on the skills that he did last year? But I at least saw enough offensively to think that there's definitely a place for him in the NBA and that he can continue to build on that. And defensively, even though I have no idea if he's just going to keep getting pushed around, I at least saw enough from like a defensive smarts standpoint with his movement and his switches to think that even if he's going to get dunked on maybe three times a game, at least he's going to be in the right spot.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Also left out, Summer League MVP, certainly building on his hype. I think the reason I wanted to go first is because I could have easily argued two names. He was certainly one of them. But the question here isn't who's going to be the best of the second year players. That's not the question.
Hmm.
It's who's going to
Yep.
exceed expectations and take a leap. I think if you're talking about exceeding expectations, what are the expectations for Cody Williams going into year two?
Nothing. Nothing.
Absolutely. He does anything and he has exceeded expectations. So, in terms of clearing this bar, answering the question as it is framed, I think Cody Williams is the clear answer. Does that mean I believe in him more than Filipowski or even Isaiah Collier? I think he and Collier could be debated a little bit just in terms of both having pretty glaring weaknesses. But um, in terms of exceeding expectations, if I had to bet on somebody doing it, it would be Cody. Because I feel like after winning Summer League MVP and after how he finished last season, Filipowski's expectations are already decently high. Whereas Cody, like you said, there are no expectations on him. He has really worked on his body and he is visibly stronger. There was a reason I was very, very low on Cody Williams coming out of the draft, and it was because his best attribute was finishing and he was a beanpole. And I didn't think he was going to keep finishing like that if he was a beanpole. I still think his lower body's a little skinny, but his upper body has definitely gotten stronger and he's finishing more often. I wouldn't say he's become a great finisher, but he's finishing more often than we were seeing him last year. And honestly, last year, I think he was just kind of broken.
Yeah.
The confidence was shot, and he's shot 14 shots in his most recent game against the Mavericks here in the preseason. And he's not nearly as shy. And so, do I think Cody Williams is going to be great? No. Do I think there's a decent chance he exceeds his zero expectations? Sure, I'll give him that.
Yeah, no, I think you make a good point here. The expectations are in the toilet. Like there's an argument that he was the worst player in the NBA last year. He was literally that bad. Um, but there are some promising things. I was watching the some more film from the preseason game against the Spurs, and even though he wasn't necessarily great in that game, he did look significantly more confident where he was shooting with no hesitation. He was really, really moving quickly on like defensive switches, and he looked a completely different player than he did last year, where he just seemed so so afraid of doing the wrong thing that he didn't even give himself a chance to do the right thing. So I think I think that's a really, really good take. I cannot tell you how much I hope that you're right and he has a really good season, or at least outperforms expectations. Because I think that would be really great for him, and I think it would be really great for the franchise. Because hey, he shot over 41% in college. He's has the perfect height for his position, and now just if he can put the rest of it together. All right. Moving on to the final award, which this one also has a name. We are calling this the George Niang Award. Uh, we watched a lot of Utah Jazz basketball back when George's first joined the team the first time. Welcome back, George. We're excited to have you on the Jazz, at least somewhat. Um, and I remember every time that he touched the ball and tried to do anything other than just catch and shoot a three, we were just absolutely terrified. Like we would see him dribble, and you and I are both just like, "What are you doing? Like it's going to be a turnover." And it really, really, it was just concerning to see him do literally anything other than just shoot. And so this year we are dedicating this award, the George Niang Award, to player we are most likely to have a visceral reaction whenever they get the ball.
Yeah, scared when they put the ball on the deck and when the ball's in their hands. Um, to me, there are two clear answers here, and there's one that I think more aptly to fits this award for this season, but we got George Niang back. It's named after him. I just feel like we're not going to talk about George Niang for the rest of the podcast. The other guy, hint, hint, we just talked about. So in order to switch the conversation, welcome back, George Niang. You're a vet now. I don't think we're going to be quite as afraid of you putting the ball on the deck, but happy to have him back, if nothing else, to have something to get some comedy out of some Jazz games when he tries to create some shots.
All right, George Niang gets the award named in his honor. Beautiful poetic justice. I don't need to beleaguer mine too much longer. I thought about Cody Williams. He's the clear answer, and I just didn't want to I didn't want to give him more crap. He had a rough year last year. I'm rooting for him. So I'm going to give it to a guy that I used to have incredibly high on my big board, which is Mo Bamba. For those of you who aren't as in the loop on the Jazz, they signed him I think it was last week, and he's now a rotation big for us. Let me give you a couple stats, which is why I think this is a relevant award. He's supposed to be a stretch five, and he's really not. Last year, he shot less than 28% from three on 1.7 assists from game, or sorry, attempts per game. And the year before, he shot 30% from three on 1.8 3-point attempts per game. So that is 2 seasons of him being absolutely abysmal behind the arc, but he still likes to take those shots. And on top of that, he had a negative assist to turnover ratio in 28 games with the Clippers last year. So, as a guy who used to love Mo Bamba, and I owned a lot of property on Mo Bamba Island for a long time, I think I'm finally ready to hang up the towel with him and just say, dude, you're a 7 footer. You've always been theoretical, but anytime he tries to do anything but, you know, catch a lob or try to play defense, I think I'm just going to be concerned that that's going to lead to a turnover and the ball going the other way.
Yeah, I mean, that's what you get for listening to too much Kevin O'Connor, is the first thing I'll say here.
Dude.
The second thing is I can't believe Cody Williams was not named in this award. The only reason I didn't take him was because I thought you would. So I think we're both going to end up losing this award if I'm being 100% honest. There's a decent chance. Mo Bamba wasn't even on my radar because I'm not certain he makes the team, and if he does, I don't think he plays like regular minutes for us outside of injury. But if he does, yeah, I can definitely see him being in the mix for this award for sure.
Yeah. I honestly thought you were going to take Cody Williams too, so I was all prepped to talk about somebody else. That will wrap up part one of the podcast, and we're going to move into section two, which is our over under section of the podcast, where Kyler and I are going to be throwing some numbers at each other and seeing how well we can predict the Jazz's 2025-2026 NBA season. And because we're competitive guys, we try to make this a competition. So here's how the game is going to work. We each have 5 over/under lines that we are going to give the other person. That other person is then going to be able to choose if they want to take the over or under on that line. And then whoever gave the over under to that person has to take the other option. And then at the end of the season, we're going to see who ended up winning the most out of these awards. So you and I are both highly incentivized to give the other person what we think is the perfect line because we're not going to have any say on if we get the over or under on that line.
Yep.
Um, 8 of these we've talked about in advance, so we know at least what the topic is, even if we don't know what they're going to set the over under at. And then we each have one wild card that we're going to present right at the end. Kyler, I've been starting off most of these segments, so do you want to go ahead and start us off with your first over under?
Yeah. I'm gonna go with a guy that we surprisingly haven't talked that much about yet in the podcast, considering he is the best player on the Jazz. And one of the over-unders that we set is the final day Laurie Markkinen will be a Jazz fan. So Jazz man. So we finally talk about him, but is talking about if he's gonna be traded or not instead of how he fits with this team. So the trade deadline is February 5th. So I'm going to set the over-under at February 6th, 2026. Basically, do you believe Larry Markkinen will be traded by the deadline, or will he be a Jazz man throughout the season?
I'm taking the over, and here's why. I think the Jazz are absolutely going to try to get him moved by the deadline if it makes sense. I think they're going to be very, very active in trade talks. I think there's a decent chance that it happens. The reality of the situation is that Lauri Markkanen has a very expensive contract. He's making over 40 million a year. Um, and it's just tough to trade players like that before the deadline. It happens, it does happen sometimes, but typically if you see a massive blockbuster trade for someone who's making that kind of money, it typically tends to happen in the offseason. And so that combined with the fact that Danny Ainge has always seemed to have a price for a guy, and if he doesn't get that price, then he's happy to wait. And Danny likes to very clearly win trades. And so I just think given the fact that how much he's making, we don't know who's going to be in the market for him at the deadline. I think it's more likely that Lauri Markkanen gets traded this upcoming offseason, so in a year from now, although I fully expect that they're going to be shopping him hard before the deadline, trying to make a deal work. So I'm going to take the over. I think that's a good line. And I guess we're going to see what happens come February.
For this one, for most of these, I tried to set a competitive line. This one, I actually didn't set the line that I wanted to for the sake of conversation. So I kind of went into this one knowing I was going to lose this line because I definitely agree. I think if Larry's getting traded, it's getting in the offseason. I almost set this for draft night next year. Um, but I wanted it to be more of a conversation about the trade deadline. So I took what I personally believe is going to be the L on this first line for the sake of better conversation. But that's the only time I'm going easy on you. So
Yeah.
there
All
you have
right.
it.
Let's see if now Karma's just going to come back and reward you, and we're going to have a great conversation on February 6th.
Yep.
Um, all right. My first line is a little more basic. I'm just going win total for the Jazz this season. Throwing a couple numbers at you. FanDuel has them at 19 and a half. It was 18 and a half last week. So we're moving up in the world.
Ace
Uh,
gave us a win.
Ace gave us a win. They have the fourth best odds in the entire league of not winning 20 plus games a season after three Eastern Conference teams, Charlotte, the Wizards, and the Nets. And we lost 65 games last year, only won 17. Um, this is not going to be a good team. I think it's accurate that they're going to be probably one of the four or five worst teams in the league this year. However, me being a Jazz fan and being a little optimistic, I think the line that FanDuel has is just a little low, but not too much. So they have it at 19 and a half, and the line I'm going to give you, Kyler, is 21 and a half.
Under. And I think I want to be optimistic as well. And I thought about trying to root for the Jazz winning, but I just got to go with what I actually think here because, again, I already threw you a softball. So with that previous line, I think the Jazz, we've talked about how they're going to be a lot more interesting and fun to watch. I just don't know how much that's going to translate to winning because I don't want to spoil too much of a future over under here. I just don't think we're going to be able to match a lot of teams defensively. Um, a lot of our best players that I think are going to be playing major minutes are not defenders, just straight up. So I just think that's going to end up not resulting in winning. And ultimately, here's the thing. I think this if this team decided not to tank for the entire year, we'd win more. But I think we're going to have a pretty tough open. And then we're just going to say, let's make sure we keep this under pick. And we will do a little bit of tanking at the end of the year, which is ultimately going to lead to the under.
It's a good take. No notes. What's your next one?
Okay. We talked about how Ace raised the over under for the Jazz win total by one. He's also raised in another category recently. He's went from barely in the top five all the way up to the second best odds for rookie of the year on FanDuel behind only Flag, who's a pretty heavy favorite and is probably going to win the award. So I'm not. So what this award is going to be, what this over under is going to be, is where he's going to place in the rookie of the year award. Again, right now he's second favorite, and I'm going to set the over under at 2.5. So the over is he finished first or second. The under is three or below.
I hate that line.
I know you
That is the
would.
perfect line. Um, just by process of elimination, I think Trey Johnson has a legitimate shot. I think he's going to get a ton of minutes and a ton of shots up. I don't think Dylan Harper is going to be in the conversation as much as Ace, purely just because I think he's going to be buried on the Spurs bench. Although I love Dylan Harper, I think he's going to be great. And then Edgecombe, I think, is a bit of a wild card. I think that he could be really, really great. I think we could look at him and say he's an incredible athlete, but he's a year away and he has a hard time adjusting to the NBA lifestyle. Uh, I think that is the right line at 2.5. I just think that I do legitimately feel that Ace has a better shot than Trey Johnson or VJ Edgecombe at winning this award. And so for that reason, I'm going to take the over, knowing that it's a little optimistic. Um, Knowing that there's at least two guys I think that could really, really challenge him for that second place spot. And I mean, Flag's a negative 220 favorite right now. Like that is a prohibitive favorite for the award. So it would be surprising if Ace won Worker of the Year or anyone else not named Cooper Flag won the award. But I do think that he's going to have a legitimate run at number two.
If we had done this podcast a week ago, I would have put it at 3.5. But he's played so well that I think not only did the odds shift in his favor, but I had to reset my over under as well. I think, like I said, I made it a tougher line this time, and I'm not going to love rooting like technically against Ace, kind of a little bit this season, but I do think the odds of him being third or lower. The rookie of the year isn't really super determined off of wins, but often players that contribute to winning will end up kind of getting decent votes if they don't win. So I could
Mhm.
see a guy like Edgecombe if Philly's kind of good ending up like somewhere
Yeah.
in second place if he's doing just a lot of everything, or Dylan Harper if he's contributing to the Spurs and they're winning a lot. So I think there's a
Hmm.
decent case that Ace could be third or lower. So I won't be mad having the under on this one.
Yeah. Good line. All right, I'm going to go back to another one just talking about placement, which is Jazz placement in the Western Conference. They are the prohibitive favorites to be the worst team in the conference. FanDuel, just for some context, they have them 500 to 1 at winning the Western Conference and like 70 to 1, I want to say, to make the playoffs. Like the Jazz are not going to be good this year and they're in the tougher conference. Um, so I'm putting the line, I bet you saw this coming, at placement in the Western Conference, 14.5. Do you think
Uh,
they're going to be the worst
Under.
or not worst?
I think
Yeah.
they're easily the worst. I think I was glad that you had this line to give to me because I think it's easily 15th. The only one that I could see the Pelicans season falling off the rails, and ultimately I could see that ruining my bet. That would also ruin them, though. They have no incentive to tank because they gave away their pick, which is
Hmm.
ultimately why I think even if their season is falling off the rails, why would they
They're
ever
still going to try to win, yeah.
tank down at the end of the season? So I think they could like end up kind of being better than the Pelicans, but still having a worse record than them.
Yeah, I think that's the right pick. I would have taken the under on literally any line you would have given me. So
15
I
and a
think you
half.
have
No,
the
I'm
right
just
pick.
kidding.
All right, I would take it the over on that because I can't lose it. But all right, what's your next one?
All right. My next one. So, another guy that I feel like we haven't talked about enough, just based on how important he's going to be to this Jazz season. Keontae George. There have been a lot of offseason storylines surrounding Keontae George and how much of a leadership role he's taken. He took a bunch of the young guys out to Texas during the offseason to train with them and have some fun. And he's talked a lot about kind of having more of a we over me mentality. He started this preseason with a 9 assist, zero turnover game. It hasn't been quite as good since, but it's still been pretty decent compared to kind of the guy that we've learned to know who kind of looks for his own shot. So this is about going to be about his assist to turnover ratio. Is he going to buy more into the team offensively than looking into his own shot? For his career, he is at a 1.91 and he was below that last year with a 1.77. I liked what I've seen from him in the preseason, so I'm going to go a little bit higher on this one. I'm going to go over under 2.5 assist to turnover ratio for Keontae George.
All right, this is actually easier than I thought it was going to be. I'm taking the under on that. Um, I think Keontae is going to make a leap this year. If I was setting the line, I probably would have put it around 2-3. Just because I think he is going to get better. I think we're going to see him become a better passer. I just think with how much of a role he's going to have with the ball handling and with the passing, he's just going to be caught a lot in traps, and he's just going to be in a position where it's going to be really hard to be efficient because of just what the Jazz roster looks like. And so I think that even though we're going to see a lot of assists, I think we're also still going to see quite a few turnovers, which is going to bring down that ratio. So I hope that I'm wrong on this one. I would love to see him break that 2.5 barrier or even get maybe even closer like the high twos or around three. Um, I just think that with the quality of the roster this year, that this is less of a I don't think Keontae is going to get better and more of a I think the situation's going to be tough and he's going to see a lot of turnovers because of that. So I'm going to take the under on 2.5.
Yeah, I think what I'm interested to see what the offense looks like this year with Walker in the game. I've really liked what the offense has looked like with Nurkic because I think it takes away a lot of the turnover opportunities for George. So Walker doesn't have the same skill set, so it will become more on him. I gotta be honest, I'm not mad having that over 2.5 here though. I was thinking about putting it like 2.4, which you probably still would have taken the under, so I should have done it. But I ended up really wanting the over here, so I set it higher so I'd be more likely to have the overs. Ultimately, was my strategy.
Yeah, I hope I'm wrong. I would love to see Keontae just take that role. And if the preseason is any indication, then it looks like he's on his way to becoming that type of guy, which is great. All right. Another just generic one from me. Placement of defensive rating. Uh, the Jazz were dead last in this award last year, literally worst defensive team in the league, 30th, and their defensive rating was 119.4, which is just pretty abysmal. Um, so are they going to be the worst? Are they going to be the second worst? Who knows? I'm going to set the line, and I feel pretty good about this line either way at 28 and a half.
That was a good line. Um, I was hoping you set it at 27.5 because I'd feel comfortable taking I guess, under would be worse. But 28.5, so they have to be one of the two worst defenses in basketball. I talked about how I think their defense is going to prohibit them from winning, but here's the case for the over here. Ace Bailey and Taylor Hendricks, and some improvement from Walker Kessler and Cody Williams. All of a sudden, if you can get those four guys, two of them are on the court at a time most of the time, you have a lot more length and athleticism than you did last year on the court. The exception, of course, of Kessler and Williams, who were on the court. But I think if you can get improvements from those two, and then the additions of Hendricks and Bailey, screw it, man. I have 28 spots if I go the over, so I'm going over.
All right. No, yeah, I think it was a good line. That's why I said it where I did. I think if you look at it, like it's tough to see a scenario, even with Bailey, even with Hendricks, where they're not going to be one of the three or four worst. Um, that's just the roster that we have right now. We're not going to be a good defensive team, but depending on the player variant, I think this could potentially be a little bit higher. I would be shocked if they're anything higher than 27, like absolutely shocked. I also wouldn't be surprised if they're dead last in the league again. Um, so yeah, I think
Yeah, I'd
that's
put their
a
ceiling a little higher than 27th, but not like much. I just think not because having a good defensive center is so important to having a good defensive team. And Walker Kessler's been a good shot blocker, but necessarily not a great defender. Will Hardy on media day talked about how that's pretty much been the focus with Walker, is making a better paint protector overall than just a shot blocker. So if that's true and you're adding all this length, I could easily see them being 26th, you know, and I'm winning this one. So gives me something to root for. Jazz defense.
It's
Let's go, baby.
it's a fun thing to root for.
Yep.
All right, what's your next one? I think we got two each left.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking about the vets. Haven't talked too much about the vets, probably for good reason. That's not the reason you're excited about the Jazz. So, just rapid fire here. Starts for a player that is 28 years or older that is not including Markkanen. So we're talking Love, Nurkic, Niang, Kyle Anderson, and Svi, the vets. How many starts are all those players combined going to get? I don't know how much time we really need to spend on this, other than saying I have been impressed with both Nurkic and Love offensively. 20 and a half.
Oh, I'm pounding the over on that.
Okay.
And the reason for this is that I think that we've seen Taylor Hendricks has been a little bit injury prone, and so I think we're going to see a lot of that. Just where we're going to have some availability issues. Ace Bailey's been great, but I also think there's some injury risk with him just because he is so skinny still. So I think that we're going to see just a lot of games where, Ace is out for 2 or 3 games, or Hendricks is out for 2 or 3 games, or Markkanen is sitting, for rest. And then we just slot in, Kyle Anderson, who's going to play for a little bit. I also think Svi has looked really good in the preseason, so I think he just might demand minutes. Um, and then there's always the possibility of a Kessler trade. So I think that's a pretty good line. I just think it's going to be closer in like the 25 to 27 range, just with some of the guys being, potentially taking some nights off.
Yeah, I think they could easily go over here. I also think with injuries, I mean, I think you're just as likely to bring Kyle Filipowski and Bryce Sensabaugh into the starting lineup as a vet.
Yeah, which we're just going to see how it goes.
Yep.
But all right, for me, this is my last one that you know about, and we're going back to our buddy Cody Williams. The line that we're going to be guessing is Cody Williams' field goal percentage. As we already mentioned earlier in the pod, he had a rough season last year shooting. He was 32.3% from the field last year and 25.9% from three. Although he wasn't terrible from the line, he shot over 72% from the line. He was much more efficient in college in his final college season, he was 55% from the field and 41% from three. Granted, that was on less than 2 attempts per game. For those who loved Cody Williams coming out of the draft, it was because you thought he was going to be a fairly efficient scorer. And you thought he was going to be a pretty decent shooter, and he just didn't show that at all last year. So for me, I am predicting that he's going to be better next year, but I don't think his field goal is going to increase dramatically. So I am setting his line for field goal percentage at 36.3%.
Easy, easy over for me on that. Easy over. I think, and it kind of goes back to, I mean, I already have shares of him being the second year elite player, so I might as well, double down. I'm not going to hedge my bets here. I'm going to double down instead. I'm expecting like 40. So I was pretty easy over here. Again, I don't, like you said, I don't think he's going to be great, but I think he was truly broken last year. And I think one thing, I think the Jazz are going to play with more pace, and I think he is going to be able to finish more in fast break. And I think the Jazz often play higher pace when he's in the game, from what I've seen in preseason so far. And I think he's just going to be much better at the rim. So, um, not great at the rim, but better. So, yeah, 36.3, I'm taking the over easy.
I set that line too low. As soon as I said it, I felt weird. I have like four different numbers crossed out on my note over here. Um, he shot 32% last year. We're gonna see if he gets better this year. I mean, if he gets 7+% better, like you think he's going to, then that would be a very significant leap for him. Um, doesn't happen super, super often, but
I just think like
only
he was
where,
the
yeah,
worst player in the league. Like 40% is not good from the field.
yeah, yeah, it's not good. He can only go up. He can only go up. And I hope he does. All right. Tyler, your special one, or the one that I haven't seen. I've
Yeah, I
been
don't know if how
excited for
much I'd call
this.
it special, but there's a couple players that I think we haven't talked about enough, but I can only do one. So I'm going to talk about the one who is been on a tear, dating all the way back to the second half of last season through the summer league, where he broke the summer league Utah scoring record and was deemed too good to play the rest of summer league. And then in preseason, has a true shooting percentage north of 70 and is the leading scorer on the Jazz. That player's name is Bryce Sensabaugh. He's hitting crazy contested threes. He's hitting step back threes. And when you're playing too tight on him, he's going to the rim. This guy is a professional scorer. And is that going to translate in a big way to the season? So I'm going to say, where will Bryce Sensabaugh rank among Utah Jazz players in points per game? And
It's
the over under is 2.5.
a good line.
Is he going to be one of the top two scorers in points per game for the Jazz this year? I almost said it lower, but based on what I'm seeing, I got to come in hot on Bryce. So I went 2.5.
Yeah. I'm going to take a small under on that. Um, I think that the 2-3 range is the most likely for him. I mean, he's been absolutely electric behind the arc. I was doing some deep dives on Bryce Sensabaugh last night because I couldn't sleep, and his shooting numbers last year were just absolutely ridiculous, which we don't have time to go into today. But he could be very, very good. I think my bigger concern about having him higher than 3 is just that I don't know how many minutes he's going to get and what the rotation is going to look like. And I just think Markkanen, assuming he plays, I mean, he is by far the best player on our team right now. And then I think Ace is just going to get more minutes and more looks. So I think he's going to have a lot of opportunity there. And then I don't think you can really count out Walker Kessler. He didn't have a bad season last year, and he might get more touches. Walker Kessler gets better every year, so I wouldn't be surprised if Walker Kessler gets like a sneaky, 17, 18 points a game and makes a little bit of an offensive leap, and then, he's in that third spot. So I think Sensabaugh should absolutely be in the conversation. I think he's been fantastic so far. Um, I just think that it's more likely he's 3 than 2.
Very well could be the case, but honestly, if I had to predict it, I'd put him at 2. I just think I don't know how much he's going to start, and he might actually end up starting a lot. But even if he doesn't start, like as a six man, I could still see him having the second most points per game on the team, just because I think the way the Jazz are set up, I don't think we're going to have like the same leading score every night. I think sometimes it's going to be Ace's night, sometimes Lauri's going to be filling it, sometimes Keontae's going to be filling it. But I think every single game coming off the bench, Bryce Sensabaugh is going to be chucking threes and making a high
Oh,
percentage
for
of them,
sure.
which is why ultimately I don't know how many nights he's gonna lead the Jazz in scoring. Although, if you're going off the preseason, Aces look fantastic, and Bryce has still been like outscoring him so off the
Yeah.
bench. So like that's why I had to set it at 2.5, and I'm happy predicting he's gonna be the second leading scorer on the team.
Yeah. I mean, I think the 2.5 line was the perfect line. Like, as soon as you were talking about it, I'm like, I really hope he doesn't put it at 2.5 because in my mind, I was like, that's the line I would put it at. Um, I think it's very possible. I'm just taking the small under for the reasons I said, but great, great line. Um, all right. Last one, last over under. This could be the deciding factor of who wins this game this year between you and me. And to do it, I need to give a little bit of context. So the line is going to be how much player salary is going to be on our roster by the end of the year. And here's the context. I'm going to make it a little easier for you. According to Basketball Reference, we're right about 150 million right now. And the first apron is at 195.9. So the Jazz have a pretty significant buffer that they can still take on salary and still stay below that first apron number. We saw this a little bit last season with the Jazz, where at the trade deadline, they were involved in like every trade, where because they have all this cap space, they're just able to help take on salary and help facilitate those trades and get assets back in return. I think that they're likely to take a very similar role this year as teams who are trying to compete, especially in the Eastern Conference, are going to want to shed players, shed salary, get a couple pieces back as they try to make a long playoff run in a very open Eastern Conference. So I think the Jazz are definitely going to have more on their salary. So with all that being said, I'm setting the line at 179.5 million. So the question basically is, are the Jazz going to take on more or less than $30 million in contracts between now and the end of the season?
Yeah. 29 and a half is where you have it. The thing is, they are only 4 million under the salary cap though. And once you get above the salary cap, there are restrictions. However, they do have the trade exception from the John Collins trade.
Hmm.
I still going to take the under because I think it's hard to get to that number because you'd have to first make a trade to get to the salary cap and then make a trade with your trade exception. I'm not saying they can't do that, and if they do, that puts them pretty much at 30. But I think since 30 is pretty much the ceiling for I think what they can add, I'm taking pretty much anything underneath that.
Yeah, I mean, it's either going to happen or it's not, right? I mean, I could see one team just really trying to offload salary or a couple teams trying to offload salary to clear up roster spots or to get rid of vets as they try to make a run. And I think that the East is wide open, which is why I think that this is possible. I debated a couple different lines, but I ultimately thought that there's a decent chance that the Jazz can just absorb, $30 million of salary for somebody, which is one of the most beneficial things you can have in the second apron NBA kind of environment. I don't know if it's going to happen, but if it does, there's only a couple of teams in the whole league who could facilitate a trade like that, and the Jazz are one of them. So,
Yeah,
no,
and
don't know if it's likely, but it's definitely possible.
I think it's likely that they'll end up taking on salary, but I like 30's towards their ceiling, which is why ultimately I want because they could take on a $23 million salary and still end up on the under.
Hmm.
So that's why I went with the under on that one.
All right. Well, time will tell. We've now discussed a bunch of different awards, a bunch of different over-unders, and I don't know about you, Kyler, but just getting back on the mic after a long hiatus, talking about the Jazz like this and thinking about what the season's going to look like, I am so excited to tune in. The preseason's been better than I was expecting. Ace is looking better than expected. Walter Clayton has looked super, super fun. And I just think we're in a position that we could have one of the funnest 19 win teams the NBA has ever seen. And we could have a great time watching
Yeah, I hope they win exactly 20 games, and that's the fewest in the NBA.
them. Yep, there we go. All right. Well, Kyler, great seeing you. Great talking to the Jazz. This has been another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective. We will be back next week with another weekly episode. We're hoping to keep that cadence throughout the rest of the season. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the comment section of the video below. And as always, please like or subscribe. It really does help us out. This has been another episode of the Upper Bowl Perspective, and we'll see you next week.
Peace.